Verse 32, Luke's going to use the word criminals, and in Matthew and Mark, they use the word alestus, which is robbers. Um, Luke here is going to do, he's going to use kakaragoi, which means one who does evil. So there's some different things going on here, but for the most part, they're very, very similar when you read through them. They lend support to one another in that the events happened as the Gospels reveal them to us. And so, what I'd like to do is let's read verses 32 through 43, and then we'll kind of go back and start unpacking as we walk through. And as we walk through, we're just going to kind of notice how Luke emphasizes the power of Christ in this section, even when he's being crucified. So that's what we're going to do tonight. So let's look Luke chapter 23, beginning in verse 32. Two others who were criminals were led away to be put to death with him. And when they came to the place that is called the Skull, there they crucified him and the criminals, one on his right side and one on his left. And Jesus said, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." And they cast lots to divide his garments, and the people stood by watching. But the rulers scoffed at him, saying, "He saved others, let him save himself, if he is the Christ of God, the chosen one." The soldiers also mocked him, coming up and offering him sour wine, and saying, "If you are the king of the Jews, save yourself." There was also an inscription over him, "This is the King of the Jews." One of the criminals who were hanged railed at him, saying, "Are you not the Christ? Save yourself and us." But the other rebuked him, saying, "Do you not fear God, since you are under the same sentence of condemnation? And we indeed justly, for we are receiving the due reward of our deeds, but this man has done nothing wrong." And he said, "Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom." And he said to him, "Truly I say to you, today you will be with me in paradise." So let's pause here and kind of walk through this. And if we have enough time, I want to kind of take you guys on a tangent. We'll kind of go on a little journey together, if that sounds fun. So that'll be the goal for tonight. The first thing we want to kind of notice here is that we have Jesus demonstrating the power to forgive even here on the cross. And so we have these two criminals, and like I said, in some places we see they're referred to as robbers, in other places they're referred to as one who does evil. But in either case, in none of the Gospels do we see that there's any kind of question about their guilt or that they need to be there. And they even own it themselves. You go down into the verses 39 through 43, and one of them basically is confessing and saying, "Hey, we deserve this because we are actually criminals, but Jesus did not deserve this." And so as Jesus, as he's hanging on the cross, they come to the place of the skull, Golgotha, and there they crucified him and the criminals, one on his right and one on his left. One of the interesting things here is the birth and the death. There's a lot of mythology around it that we don't necessarily know details, and we often hear this at Christmas, like, how many wise men came to see Jesus, and the answer is we really don't know. We know they brought 3 gifts, but that's all we know. It could have been, it could have been 24 guys that showed up. It could have been more than that. There could have been an entire entourage because of them bearing these gifts and needing protection. So there could have been a large number of people. We also, sometimes forget that they didn't actually come at Jesus' birth. They came sometime later. I mean, so there's things about that we don't really know. We think about the cross, and what's interesting about the cross, and I look, and I'm trying to see if anybody's got like a cross necklace. I see a cross on your shirt right there, which is fine. It's fine, but I remember kind of having my mind blown when I went to seminary because the professor that was kind of walking through this was like, "Okay, what does a cross look like?" And everybody's like, "Okay, this is the cross." And the professor said, "We actually have no idea what the cross looked like." because the Romans, they didn't just have one way of building a cross. There were multiple ways that they would crucify people and that they would hang them. And so some early scholars kind of thought it looked maybe more like a T, that the beam was just kind of on top, and that's how he was nailed in that way. Some believe it's more like the cross that we see. Of course, if you follow through with what happened to the apostles after Jesus' death, you have the concept of being crucified on an X, on a piece of two pieces of wood that were crossed like this, looking like an X. So we really don't know what the cross looked like. And if you're ever like in Rome, and you're going through these little boutiques and shopping centers and stuff like that, and somebody offers to sell you a piece of the one true cross from Jesus' crucifixion, probably not real. Just gonna throw that out there. And that was a big thing. Like back in the Crusades, they would come back and they would say, I found an actual piece of the cross that they crucified Jesus on. And it's like, well, that's a piece of wood, but we don't really know what it came from. And I think when it comes to things like that, like we have all kinds of questions about, the Ark of the Covenant. Where's the Ark of the Covenant? What happened to the Ark of the Covenant? And people kind of sit down and they try to figure out what happened to the Ark of the Covenant, even though Indiana Jones has already told us what happened to the Ark of the Covenant, right? We don't know what happened to the Ark of the Covenant. We don't have the cross. Even when you go to the Holy Land, like I've had several friends that have gone to the Holy Land and they go on these tours and they said, this is what happened here and this is what happened here. Maybe. I mean, that it's some of it's just best guesswork, and some of it is it's factual and accurate, and they can trace it, and some of it is we think this is what happened. And I think the reason for that, the reason that we don't really necessarily have the cross of Christ or pieces of the cross of Christ, is because the actual cross of Christ doesn't do anything. The power of the cross is the crucifixion of Jesus. That's the power of the cross. And so when Jesus is hanging on the cross, and they've got these criminals to his right and to his left, Jesus utters these words, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. And so Jesus, he demonstrates the power that he has to be able to forgive, to be willing to forgive, to have a spirit of forgiveness. And one scholar puts it this way. He says, and the prayer is answered ultimately by Christ's own death, which brings the forgiveness of sins. And so that's a fascinating concept for me in that, I want to get out and smack the guy that just cut me off in traffic around. And Jesus has people killing him and is willing to forgive them in the moment while it's happening. The power of Christ to save is truly amazing. Or the power of Christ to forgive is truly amazing, because I think about my sins. I think about, the ways that I have failed God, the things that I do that I should not do, the things that I don't do that I should do. I think about the thoughts that I have that I never act on, and I'm ashamed of them, much less the thoughts that I have that I do act on. There's so much in life that I need to be forgiven for, and Christ is willing and able and ready to forgive me anytime I'll confess and repent and ask him to. That's just mind-blowing to me. And so as he's hanging on the cross, as all of this is happening, he asks God to forgive these people because they don't fully understand what's going on. And then in the next section, what we see Luke doing is he's talking about the power of Christ to divide. And this is what I want to spend a little bit more time on. Starting in verse 35. And the people stood by watching, but the rulers scoffed at him, saying, he saved others. Let him save himself, if he is the Christ, the chosen one. The soldiers also mocked him, coming up and offering him sour wine and saying, if you are the king of the Jews, save yourself. There was also an inscription over him, this is the king of the Jews. Now, a couple of things that I want to point out here is how divisive Jesus is. We are glad. We are glad that Christ invites us into relationship, and he invites us into forgiveness, and he invites us into salvation. But we need the invitation because ultimately, at the end of the day, Jesus is divisive. And what I mean by that when I say that is Jesus is the standard against which everyone will be measured. And there has never been a person born who can come close to meeting the standard that Jesus sets. And so therefore, when it comes to relationship with God, if Jesus is the way, the truth, and the life, no man can come to the Father except through him. The standard is when we see Jesus, we see that we are divided from God. We are separated from him. And this concept is very divisive because there are some people like these religious rulers who look at themselves and they feel very proud and very arrogant. They feel like they're good people. They feel like they follow all the rules. They actually make a lot of the laws that divide other people from God, and they feel like they're better than everyone else, and they cannot stand the thoughts that Jesus could tell them that they're not good enough. And so it pushes them away from him and pushes them into their own self-righteousness. It pushes them into their own sinfulness that they don't even recognize. Jesus pushes them there because Jesus is the light, and in the light, all sin is revealed. And some people are just revolted by that. Then you have these soldiers, and they look at Jesus, and they make a mockery because they don't believe any of this anyways. The soldiers, which many of the soldiers, we don't know exactly what the makeup was of the soldiers at the time, but one of the things the Romans would do is that when they kind of conquered an area, they would offer citizenship to the elites and to the rich people and to the important people, and because their thoughts were, if we make these people citizens of Rome, they have a vested interest in Rome being strong and Rome being solid, and so they're going to want Rome to do that. They don't want chaos. They don't want confusion. They're not going to sow rebellion. They're going to want Rome to be strong. Another thing they would do is they would often raise up soldiers from amongst the people in that area. Sometimes Rome couldn't necessarily do that, so they actually had to send Roman soldiers or mercenaries. They had to hire mercenaries. Later on, as the empire begins to really crumble and collapse, that's ultimately one of the main issues that they have, is because Rome couldn't police the empire anymore. They had brought in so many, like barbarians, Germanic tribesmen, and so forth, that they had trained them on warfare, and then these guys had no allegiance to Rome, so they then began to attack Rome. They had no defense against this because they had been outsourcing all of their defense. Rome couldn't stand against them, and ultimately that's how Rome ends up having to shrink and get smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. There's just not enough actual Romans to defend Rome, and so that's one of the things. So we don't actually know the makeup specifically, but we're assuming, since the language here, it speaks of the soldiers. There's a lot of assumption here that these are not Jews, or these are not people from local who have become Roman soldiers, but these are probably the imports that they've brought in because they've not been there a long time at this point. There's still a lot of tension, and the Jews are some of them are trying to push and trying to get Rome out of there, and Rome is still solidifying in some ways. So we believe that many of these may not have been Jews, so they have different gods. And it's hard for us to appreciate what the culture was like back then, because for us, in America, there's really not this concept of, there's multiple gods and people can worship all kinds of gods, and it's just kind of an accepted thing, and you kind of make fun of this God because he worships this God while you worship this God, and you think your God is more powerful than that God. It was really kind of they all accepted that all the gods were real, and some were just kind of weaker, and some were not important, and some were this and some were that. And so for these Romans, they don't care anything about God, the Jewish God. They look at the Jews and they see they're weak, and so therefore, obviously, their God must be weak. And so they have no problem mocking Jesus either, the King of the Jews. And so what we see here is that on the cross, Jesus has the power to forgive, but he's also still a very divisive figure. He has the power to divide. And one of the things that we have to recognize is that when Jesus is on the cross and they're saying, save yourself, they're not thinking about salvation in the way we're thinking about salvation sometimes when we read this. They're thinking about salvation in physically saving himself, coming down off the cross. Jesus, you physically saved this man from his leprosy, and now he's clean. Why can't you come off the cross? Jesus, you physically saved this man from his blindness, and now he can see. Why can't you come off the cross? Jesus, you physically saved this person from their inability to walk and from being lame. Why can't you come down off the cross? That's what they're talking about. But what they don't realize is that Jesus is on the cross not because his weakness is on display, but because our weakness is on display. We are unable to save ourselves, and so Jesus has to have the strength to stay on the cross. That's a very divisive concept, that we need a Savior, and the way that we're saved is he has to die. Then we come on down a little bit, and we see, starting there in verse 39, this back and forth with the criminals, and one railed at him. We see here the power of Christ to save, and this is where I'm hoping I have some time to kind of get into some theological theory with you guys. Like some theological theory tonight? Some things that we don't really know, but we kind of guess at. That's kind of fun. I've got the floor, so I'm going to do it anyways, right? Okay. So the power of Christ to save. So you have the two criminals. One is railing at him. Here's something for you Greek scholars, because I know that you really enjoy your Greek. The word translated as railed here is rooted in the word blaspheme. It's a blasphemoi. And so that's a blaspheme, I'm sorry. And that's what he's saying. He's blaspheming at Jesus and saying, are you not the Christ? Save yourself and us. The other one rebukes him and says, do you not fear God, since you are under the same sentence of condemnation? So meaning you're about to meet God. Aren't you concerned at all about what that's going to be? Because this one believed that Jesus was the Son of God. And indeed, we justly, for we are receiving the due reward of our deeds, but this man has done nothing wrong. And he said, Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom. All right. Good stuff. Ready? Here we go. Remember that we talk about kingdom a lot. Kingdom is essential when we're walking through the New Testament. Kingdom is also one of the problems that we have, because when we think about kingdom, some people think about Jesus running the Romans out, remember, and setting up the Davidic kingdom, kind of a neo-Davidic kingdom in Israel, where Israel's going to rise to power and they're going to subjugate the neighbors that are around them, and they're going to have this golden era again. And that's what some of them were thinking. We, of course, when we come back to Jesus is teaching in Matthew, starting like in chapter 5, and we're with him in the Beatitudes and the Sermon on the Mount, and we see what it looks like to live in the kingdom of God. We're thinking, about this spiritual rule and this spiritual reign of God. George Eldon Ladd, who's one of my favorite scholars in the subject area, he defines the kingdom as simply anywhere that God rules. The kingdom is where God reigns. So if God's in control, that's the kingdom, which would be the whole universe. But when we think about kingdom, we're thinking about something specific. We're thinking about thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. We're thinking about the perfect rule of God. And so this thief obviously has this concept of kingdom, and yet he recognizes, this is interesting, he recognizes on the cross he's not going to be around for a physical neo-Davidic kingdom in Israel. So he obviously has to be thinking about a spiritual kingdom, and therefore he's recognizing Jesus as a spiritual king, a spiritual savior, one who can remember him when he comes into his kingdom upon this death. Because remember, what's this guy just said? He's just said, hey, we're about to die just like this guy is about to die. And yet his faith is, but when I die, this guy can still do something for me. Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom. And what does Jesus say? Let's read it. Truly, I say to you, today you will be with me in paradise. Where? paradise, not the kingdom. Why does Jesus not just say, when I enter my kingdom, I will remember you? Why does he say, this day you'll be with me in paradise? Let's get into some theological theory, all right? So this is not 100% proven. This is not something I would preach on a Sunday morning to people who are lesser scholars than yourselves, right? This is for the hardcore biblical nerds that show up on a Wednesday night when it's like negative 537 degrees, okay? So if we want to think about how this works, the first question I want to ask you is this. Where do you ultimately want to end up as a follower of God when you die? Where do you want to ultimately end up? Right? A lot of people would say, in heaven, right? And I would look at them and I would pat them on the head and I would say, no, you don't ultimately want to end up in heaven. Why? Because we've read the book of Revelation. And heaven is not the end. What's the end? New creation, a new heaven and a new earth where creation exists physically as God intended it, without the possibility or prospect of any sin anymore, because Satan has been cast, he's been judged, he's been cast into outer darkness, and he cannot affect, wrinkle, mangle, do anything to God's creation ever again. We will have physical resurrected bodies walking in a new heaven and a new earth with God as he intended when he initiated creation the first time. That's where we want to go. So we have to stop thinking about heaven being the end-all be-all. What we have to do is we have to recognize that there's processes in the work of God that's been revealed to us. And so what I want to talk to you just for a few minutes about is about this theological theory of something that's called paradise theory. And I don't know this. I don't know enough about this to know all of this, to be accurate. I've had conversations where people tell me this is where our Catholic brothers and sisters get the concept of a purgatory, is in this paradise theory. But we're going to walk through it. So if you go to the Old Testament, and you start thinking about death from an Old Testament perspective, and you think about what you know from the Psalms, and you think about all that, one of the words that probably comes to mind for you is the Hebrew word Sheol. And the word Sheol just means the grave. It just means the grave. And so they swallowed up into Sheol, going to Sheol, it just means the grave. And so here's what our concept is. In the Old Testament, there's this concept of death and then something else. And it's not completely fully fleshed out. So then we get to the New Testament. And there's a couple of things. There's this mention of paradise here where Jesus tells the thief on the cross, today you'll be with me in paradise, right? And so we have to ask ourselves, well, tell us about this paradise. What is this paradise? And what other verses, what other scriptures, what other things can help us to really piece together what's happening here? There's another example of, it's not called paradise, but it's called something else. It's called Abraham's bosom. How many of you guys know the term Abraham's bosom? So basically what happens is Jesus tells this story. And the story is the rich man and Lazarus, right? And if you remember the story that Jesus tells, he's talking about the rich man and he's wealthy and he's boisterous and he's arrogant and he's all this, that, and the other. And Lazarus is begging for food and he doesn't have anything. He's poor and he's downtrodden. And essentially what ends up happening is they both die, right? And the rich man opens his eyes up in torment, right? And Lazarus opens his eyes up and he's in Abraham's bosom, right? Here's what's interesting about this. There's two things that we really need to key in on here. Number one, they can talk, right? The rich man, he sees Lazarus in Abraham's bosom. And he asks him, for things, like water for his tongue, and to go back and to tell his brothers about all these things. So wherever they are, right, they can see each other. There's some form of communication, but we also are told in that there's a great gulf that separates the two. They cannot come together. Even though they're in the same kind of place, there's this gulf that comes between them. They cannot come together. And the second thing, before we just kind of rule this out and say, yeah, that's not important. That's just a parable that Jesus told. Is it a parable? In no other parable does Jesus mention a name. In parables, we hear about a certain man or a certain place or a certain this or a certain that. They're not named. This is the only place where people presume Jesus is talking about a parable where he would appear to be speaking in some absolutes, using names and specific thoughts on a specific situation. This isn't a seed was sown and a bird came. This is pretty specific stuff. So for paradise theory, what people say is this is what happens, is what we're seeing is Sheol, the grave. And in the afterlife, right, there's this separation between the two. They're together in this one place in Sheol, the grave, right? But there is the side that's condemned, and there's the side that has followed God. We can't call them saved. Why? Jesus hasn't died yet. So back when I was a senior in high school at Livingston Academy, I got a piece of mail. And this piece of mail came, and it was from American Savings Bank in Livingston, right? And it told me, hey, high school senior, soon to be graduate, if you will come open a checking account at American Savings Bank, we will put $10 in that account for you. Guess who went to American Savings Bank to open a checking account? $10. That's all it cost. I am for sale. And I remember this. Now, some of you guys may not know what these things are, but they used to have these things that were called checks. And the way a check worked is you said, hey, man, I don't have the actual cash on me, and PayPal has not been invented yet. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this official piece of paper with a routing number and an account number, and this is going to link you to my check account. And what I'm going to say is I'm going to pay you $10. Here, I'm going to put your name, $10. I'm going to come down here, and I'm going to put $10 and a line and a 00 over 100 and a line. And then I'm going to come down here, and I'm going to put, whatever it's for in the memo line, and I'm going to sign my name. I'm going to tear that out. Before I give it to you, though, I'm going to put my mouth, and I'm going to document that I wrote this check because I don't want to forget whose this check is for, because I've got to actually go back in later, and I've got to balance this thing, right? And I don't want to call out any names in this room, but there's probably one or two people in this room that have never balanced a checkbook because they just look at their app and say, oh, I've still got $5, And so then after I've balanced this thing out and recorded all this, I'm going to hand you the check. And what that check is me saying to you, hey, I don't have this money right now, but the money's coming. Payment's on the way. So the way we kind of look at paradise theory is that Sheol, there were those who had rejected God and those who had trusted God. And what they had trusted God for was payment was on the way. Payment's on the way. And so that's the way things were until Jesus dies. Paradise. Jesus And this also gets us into Peter's teachings. Bless you. This also gets us into Peter's teaching, the questions about who does Jesus preach to when he's in hell. It says he descends into hell for 3 days, and he's preaching to the captives there. Here's what paradise theory would say. Paradise theory would say that on his death, Jesus goes to Sheol, the place of the dead. And there in paradise, he preaches the gospel. He tells those people who have been waiting, who had that check written and they were waiting for the money to come. He says, payment has come. And so during those 3 days that he's dead, he preaches to the captives, right, in Sheol, and then he leads them free. He leads them to the Father in heaven. So right now, now we have something different. In our day and age, now that Jesus has died, he's been resurrected, he has ascended, we no longer have to worry about going to paradise. We no longer have to worry about just going to Sheol. We go to heaven because Jesus has paid the sin debt, and we can be with the Father because our sins have been washed away by the blood of Jesus that has been shed. Right? There's still Sheol. There are still those who are in condemnation in Sheol, hell. And when they die without the gospel, when they die having rejected God's salvation, his forgiveness, his grace, that's where they go to await judgment. And when a believer dies, the believer is taken to heaven to await what comes next in Revelation, right? Which is the great judgment. Then when judgment comes, we see in Revelation there's the potential for 2 different judgments. There's a judgment of every living thing, every living person. And they have to answer for their sins. And the Bible teaches us about being cast into outer darkness and being bound. And so hell isn't the end for those that are without God, those in rebellion against God, and heaven isn't the end for those who die in the gospel. After judgment, we see new heaven and new earth. We have the glorified physical bodies that are absent of sin, the effects of sin, the ability to sin, because the author of sin has been judged and cast away, and that's the final. That's the way eternity will be. And so anyways, this is a very quick conversation about it. But I just thought it would be kind of a neat thing for us to talk about tonight because we don't know that this is exactly the way things work. But it's one theory that I think kind of has some merit when you start digging into it. Now, there are people who are smarter than me who say no, and they'll tell you the reason why this won't work. There are people that are smarter than me, and they'll say, "Yep, this is what I think happened too." If you were to nail me down and say, "Brother Jeremy, what do you think?" I would say, "I have no idea, but it's interesting." I have no idea, but it's interesting. And the reason I like to think about it, the reason I like to kind of ponder it, is because for me, it's comforting to know that even way back here, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, God already sees Revelation. He already has a plan. He's already working his plan. It's as good as already done. It's just that time has to catch up for God's will. That's all that's got to happen. And so for me, I personally find great comfort in knowing that God had a plan, that God had a way of dealing with the saints in the Old Testament who were waiting for Christ to come and who were waiting for Christ to fulfill the promise that they were waiting for, and who are now in heaven and celebrating with the Christ who made all that possible. It just gives me great hope and great joy that we serve a God who is that thorough in the way that he plans our salvation. So, on that, let's have a time of prayer and prayer requests.